The Chinese government has found itself trapped. Teachers and doctors across the country have gone weeks without pay, schools are shutting down, and hospitals are barely staying afloat. On paper, Beijing's reports look rosy, economic growth above 5%. But behind those numbers hides a catastrophe. The tax system is simply falling apart. Trillions of yuan in debt are choking local budgets. The real estate market, once the pride of the nation, has turned into ghost towers and half-finished neighborhoods. Businesses are closing one after another under the pressure of aggressive tax audits. Ordinary Chinese families are cutting back on spending, delaying purchases, and fearing the future. It's a paradox. The economy seems to be growing, but the state is losing revenue. And when the world's second-largest economy hits such a wall, the shockwave doesn't stop at its borders. It ripples through global trade, finance, and supply chains, from Australia to the United States. Today we'll break down how China ended up in this situation, why its tax system is collapsing, and how this could reshape the global economy. At the beginning of 2025, Chinese newspapers proudly reported GDP grew by 5.4%. The number looked impressive. Beijing could celebrate victory and showcase stability to the world. But in the same report, another number appeared, and it hit like a cold shower. Tax revenues dropped by 3.5%. To the average person, this might not mean much, but in money terms, that's a loss of 174 billion yuan, or nearly $24 billion, that simply vanished from the budget. This wasn't a one-off error or technical glitch. Collections have been falling since late 2023, and the trend is only accelerating. The paradox is clear. The economy grows on paper, but the state treasury is emptying. And that means fewer funds for the most basic things: teachers' salaries, road repairs, hospital operations, and social programs. Local budgets, already burdened with debt, are now on the brink. Provinces, which provide about 70% of all public services in the country, suddenly lost their primary source of income. To plug the deficit, officials resorted to desperate measures. Some delayed payments to public employees, others cut school and hospital repair programs, and in some places, entire institutions were shut down. Imagine a city of 1 million suddenly left without funding for transportation and healthcare. This isn't theory. Such cases are multiplying across China. In some provinces, teachers are staging spontaneous protests over unpaid salaries, while doctors complain that hospitals can't even purchase basic medicines. In megacities like Shanghai or Beijing, the consequences are still softened by subsidies from the central government. But in the hinterlands, where there are no extra resources, the crisis is already being felt sharply. What makes this collapse of tax revenues especially alarming is that it's happening against the backdrop of record debt. According to official data, hidden local government debt alone is estimated in the tens of trillions of yuan. This means provinces not only fail to generate revenue, but are also obliged to pay interest on old loans. It's a classic financial trap with no easy way out. But what explains these paradoxical numbers? Why does GDP rise while tax revenues fall? The answer lies in which sectors are boosting the statistics. Factories are rushing to churn out goods and ship them abroad before the US imposes new tariffs. This export race temporarily inflates economic figures but generates little income domestically. Workers earn pennies, small companies barely see any profits, and as a result, no taxes flow in. We are witnessing what experts call growth without income. Yes, the numbers look nice on paper, but they aren't backed by real consumer purchasing power, which means the state doesn't collect enough taxes, regions are drained, and the system that sustained the entire social infrastructure is beginning to crumble. And this is only the first blow. Next came a chain reaction that hit businesses, ordinary people, and even international investors. The drop in tax revenues caught Chinese authorities off guard. In Beijing, they tried to cover it up with optimistic press releases and loud statements about planned stability. But the reality on the ground tells a different story. The central government is attempting to plug the holes with cash. In 2024, it transferred a record 10 trillion yuan to the provinces. Yet even this massive support isn't enough, because regional expenses are rising faster than revenues. At the provincial level, the situation looks like a fire being fought with buckets of water. In some places, teachers are sent on unpaid leave. Elsewhere, small clinics are being closed, and local officials are forced to explain to citizens why salaries are delayed for months. In certain regions, localized protests have already been reported. That's a troubling sign. China has grown used to stability, and any display of discontent from below makes the central government nervous. Businesses, especially small and medium-sized ones, are reacting even more painfully. In desperation, authorities have increased tax pressure, mass inspections, demands to repay back taxes, and higher corporate tax rates in certain sectors. For large corporations, this is an inconvenience, but they will survive. For small firms, which provide nearly 80% of urban jobs, it's a stab in the back. In 2024 alone, more than 500,000 such companies shut down. People are losing jobs, and with them, the ability to pay taxes. Ordinary Chinese households are also feeling the crisis. On the surface, consumer prices are falling. Deflation might seem like good news, but in reality, it's a sign of weak demand. Companies are cutting wages, downsizing staff, and people stop buying expensive goods, postpone major purchases, and are afraid to take out loans. All this creates a vicious cycle. Less spending, less tax revenue, lower wages, even less spending. Foreign investors haven't stayed on the sidelines either. For decades, China was a gold mine for them. But now, the rules of the game have changed. Profits are falling, risks are rising, and tax pressure is increasing. As a result, foreign direct investment has dropped to its lowest level in 30 years, just 350 billion yuan. For an economy that relied heavily on foreign money, this is a red flag. On the streets of big cities, things may still seem calm, but in rural areas, discontent is growing. People see schools collapsing, hospitals unable to buy medicine, and neighbors losing jobs. In China, speaking out publicly is rare. But when millions of families simultaneously feel their lives deteriorating, social tension becomes a real factor. Beijing tries to respond to criticism with promises of reforms. There's talk of a new property tax, changes to income tax, and more support for the provinces. But so far, words have not been backed by results, and trust is eroding. For the first time in decades, Chinese citizens, long accustomed to steady growth and stability, are beginning to doubt, can the state handle this crisis? To understand why China's tax system is crumbling today, we need to look back. In the mid-20th century, when the country was building socialism, taxes barely mattered. Almost the entire economy was state-owned, and instead of collecting taxes, the central government simply took the profits of enterprises. For a planned system, this worked. But for a complex market economy, it didn't. Everything changed in the late 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping launched market reforms. The state suddenly needed a real tax system. By the 1980s, taxes were introduced on goods, services, and businesses. But the system was chaotic. Regions collected most of the taxes and kept them for themselves. Beijing lacked enough money for defense, infrastructure, and large-scale projects. By the early 1990s, the gap had become critical. In 1994, a major tax reform was carried out. Revenues were divided into three categories: central, regional, and shared. The central government began taking about 55% of all tax income, leaving less than half to the regions. On paper, this looked fair. But expenses were another story. The regions provided about 70% of public services: schools, roads, hospitals. This imbalance forced provinces to look for workarounds. They couldn't simply raise taxes. That required Beijing's approval, so local officials invented dozens of fees and licenses, and later began borrowing heavily through so-called local government financing vehicles, LGFVs. These entities took out bank loans, but were barely accounted for in official statistics. At first, it looked harmless. The economy was booming. Construction sites were everywhere, and money was flowing in. But this created a ticking time bomb. Too many expenses with too little stable revenue. The only way to keep the system afloat was to rely on a single source: land sales. Formally, all land in China belongs to the state, but authorities could lease it long-term to developers. For local budgets, this became a gold mine. Developers, flush with credit, eagerly bought up plots to build towers, malls, and housing complexes. In the 2000s, land revenue became one of the key pillars of local finance. By 2010, land sales accounted for about 1/3 of all regional income. By 2020, it was nearly 40%. In some cities, revenue from land deals exceeded all other taxes combined. This allowed governments to build subways, roads, and schools, all without raising politically sensitive taxes. But the system had a fatal flaw. Land sales are one-time income. They don't provide a steady stream like income or property taxes. And in China, the income tax has always been weak, just 7% of revenues compared to 40% in the US. That meant budgets were dangerously dependent on a never-ending real estate boom. When that boom collapsed in the early 2020s, the financial system was left exposed. Developers stopped buying land, and local governments lost tens of billions of yuan in revenue. This reliance on the land-feeding trough turned into a catastrophe, the consequences of which China is still grappling with today. The bill for China's dependence on the land-feeding trough came quickly. In 2021, debt-ridden giants like Evergrande and Country Garden began to collapse. They had accumulated hundreds of billions of dollars in obligations and could no longer repay them. As a result, the land market crashed. Nationwide land transactions fell by almost 40%. For local governments, this was a devastating blow. Their budgets lost the most reliable source of revenue. By 2023, the situation had become critical. Land sale revenues dropped to their lowest level in decades. There was nothing left to fill the financial gaps. Budgets shrank and construction ground to a halt. Across the country, ghost cities appeared. Half-finished residential complexes and empty skyscrapers that now stand as monuments to a failed model. The blow also hit the real economy. Real estate dragged down dozens of related industries, from steel and cement production to furniture factories. When construction stopped, millions lost their jobs. Falling housing prices destroyed household wealth. For millions of Chinese, an apartment isn't just a place to live, that it's their main form of savings. When values collapsed, families became tens of thousands of dollars poorer in just a matter of months. Instead of stimulating business, authorities tightened tax pressure. In some industries, the corporate tax rate rose from 15% to 25%. Small and medium-sized companies were hit with a double whammy: falling demand and higher taxes. The result? More than 500,000 businesses shut down in 2024 alone. And these were the very companies that created 8 out of 10 urban jobs. Amid the chaos, foreign investors began to flee. For 3 decades, China was a magnet for outside capital. But in 2024, foreign direct investment collapsed to a record low, just 350 billion yuan. Companies that had spent decades building factories in China are now shifting production to India, Vietnam, and Mexico. For the global economy, this means major disruptions in supply chains. As China slows, electronics from Shenzhen, auto parts from Guangzhou, and textiles from Shanghai stop arriving in the necessary volumes. Europe and the US feel this as higher prices and product shortages. The real estate crash also hit global commodity markets. Australia, which once shipped 80% of its iron ore to China, has been forced to cut supplies. The Middle East and Africa are losing oil revenues as Chinese demand falls. Even Latin American countries, long dependent on Chinese loans for infrastructure projects, suddenly discovered the money had dried up. Lending volumes collapsed by 50%. All these factors feed into a chain reaction: less construction, fewer jobs, lower tax revenue, less investor confidence. And each turn of this downward spiral only accelerates the next. The Chinese economy has fallen into a trap where every move intended to save the system only speeds up its collapse. China's tax crisis has long since ceased to be just a domestic problem. It is spilling beyond the country's borders and shaking the global economy. When the world's second-largest economy slows down, it's not just numbers in reports. It's real job losses in Australian mining towns, idled factories in Germany, and holes in the budgets of African countries where Chinese loans once funded roads and ports. Global trade is feeling it at every step. In 2024, China's exports fell by 5%, the steepest drop since the 2008 financial crisis. For global supply chains, this is a shock. Electronics, auto parts, textiles, goods that for decades arrived like clockwork are now delayed or not delivered at all. Commodity markets are also in crisis. Iron ore, copper, cement. China is no longer the insatiable buyer it once was, and prices have collapsed. The Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, which for decades fed on Chinese demand, suddenly face shrinking foreign currency earnings. And with that comes social unrest at home. Against this backdrop, Beijing is trying to act. Pilot projects for a property tax have been launched, a step that could bring in hundreds of billions of yuan annually. But for millions of Chinese families who already lost money in the housing crash, this feels like an insult. Authorities are also preparing to raise the income tax, lowering the exemption threshold and increasing the top rate for the wealthy from 45% to 50%. According to estimates, this could generate up to 500 billion yuan per year. But experts warn the more the state takes, the less families spend, and the weaker domestic demand becomes. The debt situation is no better. In 2024, Beijing issued 3 trillion yuan in special bonds to refinance expensive regional loans. The central government is pumping in a record 10 trillion yuan in transfers, but this only delays the reckoning. The gap between provincial spending and stable income is still widening. And more often, a word surfaces that Chinese officials try not to say out loud: default. If provinces begin to declare mass insolvency, the consequences will be catastrophic. Millions will lose jobs, millions of families will lose their savings. And given that China makes up nearly 20% of global GDP, worldwide growth could also plunge into recession. Chinese leaders insist that reforms will stabilize the system, that there is still time. But in reality, time is running out too fast. Each new set of statistics shows tax revenues keep falling, debt keeps rising, and the gap between promises and results grows larger. And the key question today is this: will Beijing have the strength and resolve to save the system, or are we witnessing the beginning of a new global downturn, one that will hit every single one of us? Subscribe to follow developments. China's crisis is only beginning to unfold, and even bigger surprises lie ahead.